You've just written about, a headline I see is what is our collective solution to health injustice? And of course, this has a lot to do with the intense and widespread reaction to the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. And I'll start by saying, as I was mentioning to you before we went on air, I have so much to say about it that I'm kind of overwhelmed and haven't been able to write anything. But you had what I thought was a really good angle on it when talking about competing narratives.
Yes.
So let's start there. What got you to thinking about this in terms of narratives? Is that just because it's something you do? It's a
It's what it's what I do, but when you think about it, it's everywhere. The whole point, as far as we can tell, we can't get inside the mind of the alleged killer, but the whole point of this killing, this December 4th assassination, if you will, of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was to tell a story. And we know that because there were words written on the bullet casings. Words tell stories, right? Depose, denied, delay, and so much of our healthcare policy has been determined by narratives because we are told healthcare is a business, even though we know in our day-to-day lives it's an absolute necessity, something like, if not even more of a necessity than public education or libraries, healthcare. I mean, what do we have if we don't have our health, right? And so we have the system of privatized healthcare, health insurance. Some of us have access to publicly funded healthcare, flawed as it is, depending upon who we are, our age, our income, our background in armed forces, etc. But most of us have to live with this deeply flawed system because we've been convinced and told that it operates best when it's a business, when it creates profits. That's one story. The
right.
story the alleged killer was trying to tell was that the people who are overseeing our healthcare are murderers and therefore deserve to be killed through vigilante violence. That's another story. The stories that are coming out as a result of this killing, which I don't think even the alleged killer could have foreseen, and certainly the mainstream media has not foreseen. Maybe the CEOs who live with daily death threats that we don't even know about had foreseen this, which is this outpouring, this triggering of stories, horror stories of the care that has been denied to people. These are all the stories. It's about narratives. And my point in my story, in my article, was how do we create and sustain the most important story that should come out of this, which is the best concrete solution to our healthcare crisis, which is, of course, Medicare for all. We need to tell that story, and we need to tell it as a story, and we need to shape our culture, and we need to realize it. So I think for me, this was a really obvious angle because I study narratives.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I remember back around 2005, I think I wrote that the deaths from inadequate healthcare insurance in this country, it's the equivalent of, I don't know what it is today, but I estimated it then based on Harvard papers and all that, 30 9/11s every year. Several every month. So the way in which you die as a result of structural versus immediate violence has a lot to do with whether it gets attention or not. And of course, that's a narrative question too, isn't it? Uh, because executives like Brian Thompson and I will remind or tell people who don't know that I used to work in that industry, so I don't speak from a lofty moral position, but the actions or decisions that such executives take may cost lives, but they're not described that way. It's plausible deniability, the lucky Luciano principle in mafia terms. Um, and I think a lot of people are struggling with how to process this as a narrative. In other words, there's the innate revulsion, appropriately so, to murder. And yet there is also, I think, although a lot of people might not say it, an appreciation that this has now become an open topic of discussion in a way that it hadn't been before, and a fury. And of course, a lot of people are not ashamed to admit that they are pleased about a
Oh, and
murder, right?
in fact, there is mass glee
Right,
at mass glee at Brian Thompson's murder. If you go on Reddit, if you go on TikTok, if you go on social media, there is celebration because so many of us have these horror stories, and that comes from trauma, right? When people are
right,
deeply traumatized themselves because their loved ones, or maybe they themselves, were victims of health insurance companies, you feel glee and you don't even feel ashamed at openly celebrating the assassination of a person who you felt had it coming. And that, I think, says so much about the moment we live in. Because as I point out in my story, I remember I was a journalist in the early 2000s or mid 2000s when Barack Obama was trying to pass the Affordable Care Act. When many of us were wanting him to push for Medicare for all, and instead the closest he got was proposing a public option. And then you had the Tea Party formation that came in and said, and the Republican Party overtly saying that death panels were going to come between you and your doctor that would decide whether you would live or die, ignoring the fact that that's already happening, and it's health insurance death panels rather than government death panels. And we were, the right wing was convinced that they wanted government to get out of their Medicare, quote unquote, right? I remember signs saying that.
right, sure. Right. Get your government hands off my Medicare. I remember that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that also was a story of competing narratives, and the corporate narrative won out 15 years ago. We didn't even get the public option. We got a law that was a massive profit-making boon to health insurers because you had the combination of a public mandate, some cost controls, but a public mandate. So now everybody had to get privatized health
Right.
insurance. They just expanded their pool of consumers and became more and more and more profitable. So what happened in 15 years ago when we had the chance to push for publicly funded healthcare, we lost that chance. We strengthened the industry. And now here we are 15 years later. And I really hope the public, we as a people, learn our lesson that profitability is not something that should enter the equation when it comes to healthcare, and that we need a Medicare for all. But neither should vigilante violence, because really, what will it solve, right? What will that solve? I mean, there could be 100 Luigi Mangionis killing every CEO, and they'll replace them with another CEO, and we'll continue to have this system. You're not going to scare CEOs into saying, "Oh, let's not be as profitable," or "Let's give people fewer denials." They'll just be putting lipstick on a pig. We need to completely dismantle the system. So I'm hoping that out of the ashes of Brian Thompson's metaphorical pyre come the desire and the manifestation of single payer healthcare.
What all of which raises an interesting moral question. It kind of touches on the Nuremberg defense. In other words, someone like Brian Thompson could say, well, I was just doing my fiscal duty on behalf of my investors to maximize profits. It's not me. We've already heard that, in fact, from some of the United executives in discussing its death, and other healthcare executives. Well, we didn't design this system, but while you get into that complex moral question, it is true, and I'm not defending them by any means. I've been opposing private health insurance for many years and using my experience in it against it. But it is true that the system is designed to produce negative outcomes for people who need medical care. If you give me $1,000 and say, Richard, this is my emergency money. If I need any for emergency, I'll take it, but the rest you get to keep. And then you write me and say, oh, I've got an emergency. I can say, that's not an emergency, because I want to keep the money. That's not noble, but it's human nature. And that's
we've been taught to think in terms of individualism, right? Our culture is steeped in stories of individualism. So when we look at our pain from the healthcare industry, we look at our pain in an individualized way, which is why it's invisible to society. We don't want to talk about it except when we have to crowdfund for medical bankruptcies. Similarly, we think of CEO and board members of these companies as individuals who are doing wrong. We need to start thinking in terms of systems versus collective well-being, right? So there are systems in place, and Brian Thompson was working within a system we have allowed and enabled. If we don't want more Brian Thompsons to get away with denying us care, we need to dismantle the system, not kill a bunch of CEOs. And similarly, if we want to talk about how healthcare as it is impacts us, we need to start talking about how it's impacting every single one of us as a whole, not as individuals. Because and vigilante violence is also an act of individualism. Only somebody like Luigi Mangione, if he was indeed the killer, he's still allegedly the killer, could have gotten away with murdering Brian Thompson and being lionized for it. If he had been a black man, a brown man, oh, God forbid, an immigrant, we would have been talking more about the murder.
A Muslim, try that on and see how that would have gone over.
He's a hot white guy, quote unquote.
Right.
And so we can look past who he is to what he did.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the collective aspect of it as well as the narrative aspect, because it is a collective problem. I do have to say that even among the bad actors operating according to the incentives of the system, United Healthcare is especially bad. I mean, they're
the worst.
But you create a system with that incentive, somebody's going to be the worst. And you talked in terms of narratives, you talked about the multiple narratives at play here, including the gun mythology, right? The gun narrative. There's a great, you probably know it, I'm blanking on the historian's name, a book called Gunfighter Nation. It's a part of a trilogy about the American fetish with guns and the pseudo-individualism that represents, right? So there's a lot of that. And I would throw into the narrative mix the sort of revolutionary romanticism that is present on both left and right. That, whether it's Che Guevara t-shirts or the self-mythologizing of the QAnon shaman or whatever it is, the idea people want purpose in their lives.
But the other thing I do have to give some credit. Look, we wouldn't be having this conversation and people's horror stories and this mass outrage wouldn't have been provoked had it not been for this killing. I'm not at all justifying it, but what I'm saying is that before the election, which was just still a few weeks ago, healthcare wasn't even a top issue. It was the economy, it was immigration, it was all these other things, it was abortion, which of course is healthcare, but it wasn't cast as healthcare. But healthcare was not an issue that was seen as deeply important and politicized. And of course, a lot of it has to do with corporate media setting the agenda. And now we're all talking about it because this guy carried out an act of violence. And I know that there are a lot of people who really finally feel seen. They feel that this guy channeled their anger and there's this revenge fantasy that he can't carry it out, right? So let's not let Brian Thompson's death be in vain. Let's capture this moment, no matter how it was wrought, no matter how it came about. We're angry. The country is angry. Even the CEOs can't defend it. Andrew Whitty, the chair of United Health Group, wrote this terrible op-ed in the New York Times. And then, of course, you have Brett Stevens, who I didn't even mention in my op-ed because it was just so outrageous, who was talking about Brian Thompson being the true working class hero. But but Andrew Whitty, was saying that even we wouldn't design a system. We're sort of stuck with the system. But what we can do is offer greater transparency in how we do denials. He doesn't have a solution other than telling us better in better detail why our health coverage is being denied. So they can't defend it, and they're on the defensive right now. It's time for all of us to get on the offensive, not through violence, but through collective solutions and a mass movement for Medicare for all.
Well, I always say that the numbers. First of all, the numbers vary, but let's say that 60,000 people a year die somewhere in that neighborhood because we don't have Medicare for all, we don't have first dollar coverage, we don't have universal coverage, then I always say that make that 60,001, because if we had Medicare for all, Brian Thompson would still be alive too.
Really? Exactly. I love that you brought that up. Exactly. And by the way, there is another connection between gun violence and our health system, which is that victims of gun violence, survivors of gun violence are, and we have, gun violence is one of the leading causes of children's deaths and injuries. And our privatized health insurance system is not very good to victims of gun violence.
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, and there was a story I'd written maybe a year ago that pointed that out, and there was a Reddit thread about how Brian Thompson, had he survived and had he been underinsured and poor, would likely have not gotten coverage or been fully covered for having his bullet injuries treated at a hospital, and
Right.
that's important for us to think about as well. Those interesting links that you are talking about. But yeah,
Right.
there's so much to be said here. This is such an bizarre and yet important cultural moment.
Yes, and it's very interesting for those of us who, like you and me, are strong supporters of Medicare for all, because it's a guy striking a blow for the right thing and advancing the cause of the right thing, but in the wrong way. So I found myself in this kind of maze of, not so much fear of being criticized, as just sort of setting all my moral compasses to the right levels and balancing them correctly. It's tough,
Totally, totally. Yeah. I mean, you want to be happy that we have the chance to discuss this, but the way it came about through the loss of a human life, which I can never, I mean, really, the loss of a human life, and yet the loss of so much human life through health. I mean, we keep having to weigh it. Brian Thompson's life, the tens of thousands of people who die because they're denied care, and all of it is a tragedy. And let's prevent all of those deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer, I totally agree with you, is Medicare for all. The answer is a rational system, not one that encourages either draws sociopaths or encourages people to numb themselves and become sociopathic and blind to the consequences of their actions, which is how a lot of the people I encountered in that world behaved. They were nice people,
Yep.
but they just shut off a portion of their brain that considered the human results of what they did. And I was considered too weak, ultimately.
And they shouldn't be blamed for shutting that part off, because again, they are working in systems. They're part of a system. We have to dismantle the system. You can't, if you try to just kill all the people in a system, the system will rebuild itself. You got to destroy the system.
Right, absolutely. And so, as you say, and I like that framing of it, let's do that so that the deaths of all 60,001 people, if we include Brian Thompson, aren't in vain, right? We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.